The wind had a bitter snap to it that morning, the kind that rolls off the cliffs and slices straight through your coat. I was walking the back trail behind my cottage when I first heard her, low, guttural hissing from inside the collapsed barn near the sheep field. Nestled in the shadows, hidden beneath rotted boards and hay, was a small black and white cat, her body curled tightly around 3 trembling newborns. Her eyes met mine with fire. She wasn't just scared, she was daring me to come closer. I froze, heart pounding. I knew in that instant, this wasn't going to be simple. I came back the next morning with a plan and a basket full of sardines. The old barn creaked and sighed like it was holding its breath. I moved slow, careful not to step on any loose boards that might spook her. Marla was still there, exactly as I'd left her, curled around her kittens, eyes locked on me like knives. She hissed the second I stepped inside, low and long, her tail twitching behind her. The kittens, barely a few days old, were no bigger than my palm, 3 wriggling bundles of fur, blind and silent. One had a crusted eye, another was struggling to nurse, and the third, a gray one I'd later call Moss, was just lying still. Not dead, but weak. I knew I couldn't just walk away. I set the sardines down a few feet away and sat back on an overturned feed bucket. I didn't reach for her. I didn't speak. I just waited and waited. Edith had warned me about feral mothers, how their rage was fueled by fear, not hate. She said if you make her feel cornered, she'll fight like a wolf. But if you make her feel seen, she might let you stay. So I stayed. By dusk, she hadn't touched the food, but she hadn't lunged either. That was something. The wind outside howled through the slats, but inside that barn, we just sat, 2 creatures who didn't know if they could trust each other. The days bled together in a haze of quiet persistence. I returned to the barn every morning and evening, bringing fresh food for Marla and keeping my distance. Her behavior hadn't changed much, though. She would hiss whenever I got too close, her back arched and fur bristling. But she didn't attack. I had to take that as progress. I kept my focus on the kittens, nourishing them when their mother wasn't looking. Moss, the gray one, had grown weaker each day. He was smaller than the others, always huddled away from them, as if he knew something the others didn't. I wasn't sure he would survive. One afternoon, as I sat on the haystack, my hands shaking with the tension of trying not to intrude too much, Theo arrived. He was young, too eager for his own good, always rushing into things. He had a heart of gold, but sometimes that was more dangerous than helpful. He moved too quickly, not reading Marla's body language. "She's just scared," he said, crouching too close to her. "We can't leave them here. We should take them to the shelter." "No," I said, shaking my head. "She's their mother. If we take them from her now, we risk losing them all." Theo pulled back, his face a mix of frustration and confusion. I saw the struggle in his eyes. He didn't understand, but I did. Marla needed space. She needed to feel like this was still her choice. It was on the 6th morning that the rhythm broke. The barn, usually trembling with Marla's low growls and the faint rustle of straw as the kittens wriggled beneath her warmth, was unnervingly silent. The cold had settled deep into the wooden beams overnight, and the early light filtered through the cracks in long, thin beams like ghost fingers searching the dark. As I stepped through the warped doorway, a strange weight dropped into my stomach. There was no sign of Marla, no flash of fur retreating to the shadows, no furious hiss announcing her authority. Just stillness, a silence that clung to the air like fog. I moved quickly but quietly, scanning the dim corners where she usually huddled. The kittens, Ash and Bramble, were still there, tangled in a stiff piece of burlap near the feeding dish, their cries sharp and confused. They were hungry, but otherwise unharmed. But something was wrong. There were only 2. Moss, the smallest and most fragile, was missing. My breath caught, and I dropped to the floor, scraping my hands against straw and debris as I searched feverishly under every loose board, every fallen beam, the cold biting through my jacket sleeves. My thoughts blurred with dread. Had she rejected him? Buried him? Had something gotten in during the night? Then, out of the corner of my eye, just past the crooked barn door, I saw a small gray bundle half curled under a dented metal water trough, the edge of it buried in frosted earth. I ran out, slipping on the damp ground, and fell to my knees beside him. Moss was there, barely more than a whisper of life. His fur was wet, his breath shallow and rattling, his tiny body ice cold against my palms as I scooped him up and wrapped him inside my coat. For a moment, I just held him, feeling the fading flicker of his heartbeat against my chest and wondering whether I had arrived just moments too late. Then I sensed it. That electric tingle on the back of my neck, like I was being watched. Slowly, I turned toward the tree line that edged the field behind the barn, and there she was, Marla. Her form was low and still, crouched just at the edge where wild bramble met open field. She wasn't snarling or running this time. She was just watching, her gaze sharp, not aggressive but measured. Her ears flicked once, and her tail was curled tightly around her paws. She looked as if she had placed something fragile in the world and didn't know whether she should take it back or let it be helped. In that moment, it all began to make sense. Marla hadn't abandoned Moss. She'd carried him out of the damp, bone-cold barn and laid him in the morning sun, choosing the only dry spot nearby in a desperate bid to warm him. Her instincts weren't failing. She was doing everything she could with what little she had. She hadn't given up. And now here I was, standing between her choice and my own, unsure whether helping meant stepping in or stepping back. Back inside the cottage, I laid Moss in a shallow box lined with wool and a hot water bottle tucked beneath layers of towels. His breathing was still shallow, but it was steady. I moved with a quiet urgency, trying not to panic, recalling Edith's instructions from the day she taught me how to warm up hypothermic kittens. As I dabbed the corners of his tiny mouth with a syringe of kitten milk, I heard the crunch of gravel outside. Theo had returned. He bounded in with energy that felt painfully out of place, his boots still caked with mud and his hoodie pulled halfway off one shoulder. "You found them? Did she let you take them?" he asked, eyes widening when he spotted Moss wrapped in flannel on the table. "She didn't let me," I replied softly, not looking up. "She was watching." He tilted his head. "Watching?" "She moved him outside. I think she was trying to save him," I added, almost more to myself than to him. "She didn't abandon him. She trusted something else might help." Theo didn't respond at first. His face softened, confusion giving way to something quieter, maybe respect, maybe guilt. "So what do we do now?" I shook my head slowly. "We wait, and we keep her in this with us. This isn't just a rescue, this is a negotiation." Outside, I caught a glimpse of her again. Marla, perched under the same hedge. She hadn't run, she hadn't left. And for the first time, she didn't look like she wanted to chase me away. The following morning, I woke to the sound of heavy boots crunching frost outside and the low murmur of voices drifting through my front window. When I opened the door, Edith stood at the gate with her hands folded into the sleeves of her thick wool cardigan, speaking quietly with a man I didn't recognize. Tall, lean, the kind of man whose presence filled empty space like smoke. His pickup truck, dented and rusted along the sides, idled at the edge of the lane, casting long shadows across the grass. He was from the council, she told me later. Complaints had been filed. Someone had seen me going in and out of the barn, their barn. The owners were thinking of having it torn down, maybe within the week. Liability, rot, unwanted attention. The usual reasons. The man didn't care about the cats. He hadn't even asked. I felt the cold settle into my ribs as Edith's words sank in. The barn wasn't just a shelter for Marla and her kittens. It was the only space left that hadn't yet told them they were unwanted. And now even that was disappearing. Inside, Moss stirred weakly in his box. He was growing stronger, enough to lift his head now, though he still cried when the air grew too cold. Outside, I spotted Marla again, closer this time, standing right in the open. She was watching the truck, her ears turned slightly back, tail twitching with unease. Somewhere in that stillness, I realized the rescue had shifted. We weren't just fighting to earn her trust anymore. We were running out of time. That night, long after Theo had gone and Edith had promised to see what strings she could pull, I sat alone in the kitchen with the kettle steaming and the house wrapped in hush. Moss was curled beneath the warm light of a desk lamp, sleeping more soundly than he had in days. Ash and Bramble were still in the barn, under Marla's care. I hadn't moved them, not yet. I couldn't bring myself to pull them away from her, not when she'd finally started to see me as something other than a threat. But a voice kept turning over in my mind, one I hadn't invited but couldn't silence. What happens if the barn is gone tomorrow? What if you're not there when it happens? Will they survive? I leaned forward, elbows on the table, and stared at the worn wood grain until it blurred. I didn't want to force them into a new world they hadn't chosen. I didn't want to strip Marla of the last thing she had, her role, her dignity, her small defiant piece of control. But I also didn't want to watch them vanish. Sometimes I thought rescue wasn't about making things better. Sometimes it was about choosing which kind of loss you could live with. By the time the storm rolled in, the land had already begun to feel uneasy. The wind dragged branches across rooftops and tore dry leaves from the hedgerows like they were secrets being pulled from old hands. I made my way to the barn that afternoon with the weight of Edith's words still tucked behind my ribs. She'd spoken to the landowners, but they weren't moved. In fact, someone had nailed a bright orange notice to the barn's front post. Unsafe structure. Demolition scheduled. 2 days. The air inside was colder than usual, the scent of mildew thick and sharp. I called softly, a whisper, just to let her know it was me. But there was no response. No growl, no rustle, only stillness. My heart quickened as I moved deeper in, stepping around the old feed barrels and broken timbers. The corner where Marla usually nested was empty. The burlap nest had been pushed aside, scattered, the straw still warm, but no sign of fur, no kittens, no mother. I searched every inch of that barn, even crawled into the rafters and behind the splintered stalls, heart thudding louder with every empty corner. Outside, wind rattled the loosened boards and rain began to tap softly on the metal roof. But there was no Marla, no ash, no bramble. It was as if she had vanished into the landscape, taking her young with her. No goodbye, no warning, just silence. I stood there, soaked in shadow and disbelief, with one truth burning at the edges of my thoughts. I wasn't sure she would come back. That night was restless. Moss cried out twice in his sleep, each time more urgent than the last, his tiny limbs twitching like he was reaching for something that wasn't there. I fed him slowly, whispering things I wasn't sure he understood. Maybe I wasn't even saying them for him. Maybe I needed to hear them myself. You're safe now. I've got you. They'll be back. They'll be back. But morning came, and the barn remained hollow. Theo showed up just before noon, soaked from the rain, clutching a pair of mismatched gloves and that persistent hope of his, the kind that cracked me open and exhausted me all at once. We searched the hedgerows and fields together, calling softly, crouching beside brambles and peering into drainage pipes, following every flicker of movement like it might be her. A rustle turned out to be a pheasant. A flick of white was a plastic bag caught on thorns. Then, near the crumbling stone wall that marked the end of my field, Theo stopped mid-step and pointed. There, he whispered, voice low like it might break the moment. Under the twisted roots of an elder tree, in a shallow patch of leaf mold, lay ash and bramble, tucked tight beside each other, wide-eyed and damp, but alive. And beside them, barely visible in the underbrush, Marla stood guard, her body pressed low to the ground, eyes fixed on us. But she didn't hiss, she didn't bolt, she just watched. We stood in silence for a long moment, hearts thudding, boots sunk in mud, before I crouched and lowered my hand, palm open, not asking, not demanding, just offering. Marla didn't move, but she didn't turn away either. In the quiet breath between fear and trust, something had shifted. Not enough to call it peace, but enough to hope. The next morning brought a pale, watery sun and the low rumble of machinery somewhere down the road. I knew what that meant. The council wasn't bluffing. The demolition crew would be here by midday. The barn, with all its silence and shelter, was marked for erasure. Whatever time we had left was measured in hours. I wrapped Moss in his blanket, tucked him against my chest, and made my way back to the elder tree, where Marla had curled herself with the others like a fortress of fur and bone. She blinked slowly when I arrived, no greeting, no alarm, just acknowledgement. She knew I was coming. She may have even been waiting. I sat near her, a few feet back, speaking gently, explaining things she couldn't understand but needed to hear anyway. I told her the barn was going. I told her I couldn't leave them here, not with the noise and the rubble and the threat of trucks barreling over the land. I told her I could take them somewhere safe, somewhere warm and quiet where no one would chase them off. But even as I spoke, part of me recoiled. Who was I to decide? to rip her away from the only patch of earth she'd claimed as her own, to separate her from the trees and shadows she knew like breath. Theo arrived with a carrier and soft towels, his face uncertain. Edith stood by the gate, watching with her arms crossed tightly over her chest. It was time. And still I sat there, frozen by the weight of choice. Rescue meant protection, but it also meant power. And in that moment, I didn't want to hold any more power over her. I only wanted her to choose me back. The sound of the demolition crew's truck engine was distant but steady, like a drumbeat counting down the moments left to decide. Theo knelt beside me, holding the carrier open, his brows drawn in tight concern. "If we don't move them now," he said, voice hushed but urgent, "they'll be gone when the backhoe rolls in. You know that." I nodded but didn't move. Marla still hadn't. She remained curled beside her kittens, her body wound in that tense, unreadable stillness. I could see it in her eyes. She knew something was ending. Her ears twitched at every new sound. But she didn't flinch. She didn't run. She was watching me. I had imagined this moment differently. I thought she'd bolt, that I'd have to trap her or rush in before she slipped away. But she wasn't fleeing. She was waiting, testing me. I reached into the pocket of my coat and pulled out the same soft cloth I'd used to dry Moss the night I found him near the trough. Slowly, without speaking, I placed it near her paws. The kittens stirred. Bramble mewed softly, nose twitching. Marla looked at the cloth, then at me. And then slowly, so slowly I thought I'd imagined it, she moved. She nudged Bramble forward with her nose. Then Ash. Then paused. One last glance at the barn in the distance, the only home she'd known. Finally, she picked up Bramble by the scruff and padded toward me, dropping her gently into the cloth-lined carrier. Theo exhaled sharply. I didn't move, afraid the spell might break. Marla stared at me again, one last time, and without sound or command, she crawled in beside her kittens. In that moment, she didn't choose rescue. She chose trust. And it was everything. The carrier sat between us like a fragile agreement, trembling slightly with the movement of 3 tiny bodies inside. Marla huddled over them, her breath shallow, eyes flicking toward the open barn in the distance, as if she was already mourning something we couldn't see. The machines were closer now, their metallic growls rising as engines idled at the edge of the road. I could hear the clatter of men unloading tools, the slam of truck doors, the murmur of voices that didn't know or didn't care what lives had once clung to this forgotten corner of the world. I stood up slowly, brushing soil from my knees. Theo looked up at me, waiting for a signal, his hand still resting on the carrier handle like he was afraid to move it without permission. Edith, who'd watched the whole thing unfold with quiet gravity, stepped forward, her voice soft but unwavering. "They won't wait long," she said. "If we're going, it has to be now." But my legs wouldn't move. Something in me, stubborn, aching, was still standing beside that elder tree, beside that barn, beside every choice that had led to this moment. Taking Marla meant taking her from the wild rhythm of her world. It meant asking her to adapt, to accept the soft cages of safety and routine. It meant replacing freedom with protection. And as I looked into her unblinking eyes through the carrier's mesh, I couldn't tell if she was forgiving me or simply enduring it. Still, she didn't resist. She didn't growl. She simply lay there, still as stone, guarding what was hers. The kitten slept. The sky above turned pale and windless, as if holding its breath. We lifted the carrier together, and just like that, we left the barn behind. The shelter was quiet when we arrived, too quiet. Afternoon light filtered through the blinds in long, pale stripes that crossed the tiled floor like faded memory. The smell of disinfectant and dry kibble clung to the air, and the hum of the heat lamps in the recovery room was the only constant sound. I carried the carrier through the back entrance, Theo close behind me, hands shoved deep into his pockets, shoulders drawn tight with uncertainty. Marla hadn't made a sound the entire trip. She lay curled protectively over her kittens, eyes half-lidded but alert, always alert. When I placed the carrier on the counter, she lifted her head, not panicked, not angry, just watchful. The staff gave us space, moving with quiet efficiency around the room, glancing at me with professional concern, but not asking questions I couldn't answer. Edith arrived minutes later with an old soft fleece blanket from her home and a look that told me she had seen 100 stories like this before, and that none of them ever got easier. I opened the carrier slowly, expecting her to bolt, to turn feral again under the strange lights and foreign smells. But instead, she stayed where she was, just lifting her nose toward the warmth of the lamp above. Her kittens stirred beneath her, their soft, uncoordinated limbs stretching toward the new heat. And then I saw it. Her eyes, no longer hard but tired, wary, resigned, maybe even grateful. It wasn't the kind of ending people expect. There was no joyful leap into my arms, no purrs, no victory. But she let me touch her, not as a rescuer, not as her savior, just as someone who had stayed long enough, quietly enough to be trusted. Weeks have passed since that day. Moss sleeps curled on a fleece blanket near the radiator in my cottage now, his tiny body stronger, his breathing steady. He still cries out in his sleep sometimes, and I wonder if he dreams of the trough, the cold earth, or the sound of his mother's heart. Ash and Bramble remained with Marla at the shelter, where they were given their own quiet space in the back room, away from barking dogs and the noise of the world. The staff keep their distance. She allows only a few to come close. Marla hasn't softened completely. She still watches everyone with that same sharp gaze, never fully letting her guard down, but she stays. And in her staying, there's a kind of permission, one that doesn't need to look like affection to mean acceptance. I still visit her. Sometimes I sit by the door of her room without speaking. Sometimes I bring her the same sardines I used on that first day. Most times she doesn't come forward, but she doesn't hide either. And maybe that's enough. Rescue isn't always about happy endings. Sometimes it's about giving something wild the choice to be safe. Sometimes it's about learning to hold space for a creature who may never come closer, but who knows you stayed. And maybe if we're lucky, that's the part that stays with them. And with us. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever stood in that quiet space between fear and trust, between helping and letting go, share it. Let others feel what it means to offer care without conditions. Because sometimes, the most powerful part of rescue isn't the transformation. It's the patience, the presence, and the choice to stay, even when nothing is certain. Thank you for watching. If this story meant something to you, consider subscribing, leaving a comment, or simply passing it along to someone who understands the quiet beauty of earning trust. One breath, one heartbeat at a time.